Good morning. This is House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. Today is Tuesday, March 31st at 9:03 a.m. And this morning, we're going to start our week off with House Bill 837, an act relating to rounding cash transactions. We're starting here with Cameron Wood, our legislative counsel from the Office of Legislative Counsel. And good morning, Cameron.
Morning. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. We're going to do a quick walkthrough of 837. I know you have quite a few witnesses lined up, so. Okay. 837, an act related to rounding cash transactions. So the first two sections here, we have a short title and then a purpose statement. Short title, the act may be cited as the Nickel Rounding for Cash Transactions Act. And then a purpose statement, the purpose of this act is to authorize the rounding of cash transactions to the nearest 5 cents where 1 cent coins are unavailable or impractical, while ensuring legal clarity and consumer fairness. So this would go in Title IX, very beginning of Title IX. As you can see, we're going to create a new Section 2. So there already is a Chapter 1 for money of account. And then there is a Section 1 just identifying that, the money for transactions in the state is going to be the dollar, cent, and mill. And so we're going to add a new Section 2 here at the top of Title IX for nickel rounding. We have a few definitions to start with. Cash, coins or paper currency in the United States. Cash transactions, sale of goods or services where payment is made entirely or partially in cash. So first thing to note, and we'll get there, here further, we're not talking about electronic transactions. So if somebody's using a debit card or a credit card or some other transaction that is occurring electronically, this is really only going to address transactions that are done in cash. So then we have rounding, adjusting the final total amount due after taxes and fees to the nearest 5 cent increment. And then we get into the meat of the section, which is really sub B, which is authorization. So a person or business engaged in a cash transaction may round the final amount due to the nearest 5 cents as follows. And it has the A and the B, where if the transaction ends in a 1, 2, 6, or 7, it would be rounded down to the nearest amount divisible by 5. So if you're to a 0 over 5. So if it's a 3, 4, 8, or 9, will be rounded up to the nearest amount divisible by 5. So rounded to the nearest nickel. Then we have sub 2 here. If a person or a business is rounding for a cash transaction, the refund of the amount paid shall be issued to the purchaser in the exact amount initially paid. So, if the business is rounding a transaction at the conclusion of the transaction, then someone comes back and wants a refund of that amount, the business has to refund the same amount that was paid at the end of the transaction that was rounded. So the business wouldn't be able to provide the exact amount back based on the time of the sale before rounding. We get to the top of page 3. We have a few exclusions here. So as mentioned, does not apply to electronic and other non-cash payments. It wouldn't apply to the payment of wages. So businesses that are paying individual employees, the amount that they're due can't round up or down depending on those amounts that are required to be paid. Doesn't apply to rebates or cash disbursements. It does not apply to transactions governed by federal law that prohibit rounding. We have an application, notwithstanding any law or the contrary, rounding under this section shall not constitute an unlawful price increase, surcharge, unfair or deceptive act or practice in commerce or discrimination. I think this section kind of somewhat begs the question of whether this is a necessary statutory change, that anticipating that question potentially. I don't know that it is. I'm not aware of anything in the consumer protection laws of Vermont that would prohibit a business from doing this now. Okay. Businesses have the ability to set their own prices, and if a business wants to go in because of a shortage of pennies at present and because of the discontinuing of the creating and dispersing of pennies. If a business wanted to go in and just set all of their transactions or all of their, price points to equal something that ended in a nickel, I don't know that there's any prohibited business from doing that now, because I'm not aware of one. But I do think this could help signal public that this is something that is specifically authorized. And this section would state that an individual wouldn't be able to bring some sort of claim of discrimination or consumer protection argument that the business was, discriminating or doing some unfair, deceptive act by rounding a transaction at the end. So I do think there could be some value in it. I'll say that there are many other states that have introduced similar pieces of legislation. There are a few states that have passed them, a few governors that have signed them. I can give you a list if you're interested. They're all pretty similar to what you have here with some slight differences. Some more detail, some less detailed, but in general, most of the bills that I've seen anyway are very similar to what you have here. There was some language introduced at the federal level that currently, I don't remember off the top of my head where it sits exactly, but there was some legislation that was introduced in Congress, but I don't think it's gone very far. So you do have a lot of states that are passing similar types of things.
With that brings me in the exclusions, you had transactions governed by federal law that prohibits rounding. Are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of federal law that would prohibit rounding. My understanding from the sponsor and where the bill was coming from, that was really intended to, similar to what we have regarding wages. You can't round when you're paying someone wages. There are certain, disbursements that are made for different programs at the federal level. You all know, I'm very familiar with unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is technically those payments are already rounded. There's state law and authorized under federal law, but in theory, there are circumstances where you could pay individuals 30 cents out if they had an overpayment, for example, or if they were reporting wages and could end up with cents transactions. And so many different federal programs that exist, as you all know, different housing programs, different food assistance programs, et cetera, et cetera. So just if there are any programs that would prohibit the rounding of the transaction, that section is intended to, you don't want to have some sort of conflict. So back to the sub E here, optional use. So the section does not prohibit a customer from tendering exact cash, including 1 cent coins, unless the person or business has provided notice that the person or business rounds transactions in accordance with the section. So this is all permissible here. It's not a requirement. It wouldn't mandate that businesses do this. Section shall not require a person or business to accept cash if the person or business has posted a policy stating that the business does not accept cash. It's a notice requirement. Business has to post a disclosure and it clears its terms at the point of sale or on customer receipts. One thing I pointed out to the sponsor of the bill, and I'll point out here, if you're wanting to require a notice, it may not make sense to put the notice on the receipt because that could be after the transaction actually occurs if you're wanting to ensure that the customer is fully aware. So just a point that I mentioned there, because this is an or, so the business could do either. I've seen the required notice in the other bills. That seems to be pretty standard. Taxes shall be calculated and remitted based on a pre-rounding amount. You don't want to have additional tax being charged and remitted to the state based on the rounding amount that occurs at the end of the transaction. And then finally, an effective date, July 1 of 6.
Yep. Any questions?
Okay. I'm here if anything.
All right.
Aggie?
Yeah.
Did you say my name?
I did
Did
not.
I hear my name? Oh, I thought I heard Abby. I was like, what?
Aggie.
Abby, it's close.
It's
That would be
close.
something I would say.
And good morning, Abby. Good morning, Maggie.
Good morning. Maggie Lyons here on behalf of the Vermont Retail Grocers Association. I think, I'm not going to be late by reading my full testimony. It's posted, so you guys can read it. I'll just say, we worked with Rep Casey over the summer and fall to get this introduced. This was born from the retail grocers out of just a lack of security around offering guidance to their members. The members are asking if they can or cannot round up or down. The Retail Grocers Association, just at this point, until this is a formalized practice, does not feel comfortable giving guidance to businesses, and there is some confusion on the ground. Could this be considered an unfair deceptive practice, et cetera? So we felt like this was a good model to use. They have used this model for a while in Canada, sometimes referred to as Swedish rounding. It is, I think, looking into various systems, doing a voluntary or not a mandated approach seemed to be the best fit. There are some states that are requiring this in statute, and we felt like it would be better to make it optional for businesses, but just the purpose is to formalize practice that businesses are using now, and just to give them the confidence that what they're doing is not going to result in lawsuit. So that's really the basis. I think it's a pretty straightforward bill. Really hope to get this done this session, maybe put it into economic development or something.
Hi, thanks. I think you pointed out that it's not a mandatory requirement. It's voluntary, and that I take it some grocers are already doing this. If folks can do it already, what's the purpose of it?
There is a real question whether it could be considered an unfair and deceptive practice under the Consumer Protection Act. The association would just like businesses to have absolute certainty and security that this practice, which is going to have to be used more and more frequently as pennies are disappearing, they just want security so that they know this is allowed.
Have you had some legal sort of analysis of why the practice might be unlawful?
We haven't done our own now.
Okay.
But to legislative counsel's point, other states are also passing these
Sure.
bills. It really does seem like there's a question beyond Vermont's laws, that this is something that is creating uncertainty. And I also think putting it in statute, so it signals to businesses that it's okay, and I think creates hopefully a little bit more uniformity around the practice that's being used. I think this really is the nickel rounding up and down is the most fair system. Putting it in statute, I think, will help create a more uniform approach on the ground.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that we're trying to get at this before it's a real problem. Can you talk about inconsistencies across the state? Are you aware of inconsistencies across the state where some businesses are having issues already and others are not? Or do we not have an issue getting pennies yet? And we're trying to make sure that when we do have a problem, we're covered.
It's inconsistent. There certainly are members who've reached out because they have had they've had trouble making change, and they wanted to know how to respond to it. So, and then there are some members who were surprised this was an issue because they haven't. So it is inconsistent. I'm not really sure what the reason is. I haven't analyzed who the members are that have issues, but yeah, I'm good one.
Yeah, I think it's the larger retailers that are having a hard time getting pennies. Then smaller, that's what I found where, the Walmarts and Shaw's and those businesses are having a harder time, and that's where they're instituting the round up, round down. Then, but mine, I generally don't have a problem getting pennies at my small store, but
I will say we've definitely heard from small members as well. So not that that's incorrect, that larger retailers are struggling, but there has been outreach.
By this is more from Ledge Council, but this would be it's not a statute, it's not forcing anyone to more guidance than anything else. And how does that get us away from the issue of the fair and deceptive practice?
Well, it would be in statute, so I think it isn't just guidance. I think it's offering security, but at the end of the day, I think would be enough. It would go beyond guidance.
So what happens to a business if they choose to do it a different way? Then does that open them up to possible suit on unfair and deceptive business
I
practice?
mean, if this bill was passed and then they rounded a different way.
Yeah.
I don't think I can answer that question. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not sure, to be honest. I could try to get an answer for you,
I'm just wondering, does it make sense to this guidance or is it mandatory? But, you know, that's,
But we'll say, I think we're not locked into this approach, really. Just we're looking for the result that we're looking for is just some security, clarity, so that the Retail Grocers Association can feel confident giving guidance to their members, their businesses feel confident.
so I just worry that we had something and someone deviates from that, does that open them up?
I think it's a good question.
I think we should focus on, I mean, either you're rounding or you're not. And if you're not, then no problem. That's the way it's been done for years. If you are, this is the statute. You have to use this formula if you want to round.
Yeah, but what worries me is if we just use this as guidance or actual law that this is the way you are going to do it.
I think it should be optional to round, but if you're not, but if you are rounding, you should be required to use this method.
Well, if you don't have pennies, you have option, right?
Right.
I mean, credit cards and you're still accepting checks, that's one thing that when you're working with cash, if you have no pennies anymore, it's the option is right.
So then Maggie, probably it's gonna be helpful for you to get feedback. If this is not optional, how do how do the retail grocers associate, right? Like that's
I mean, if the bill was changed so that this was the mandatory system for rounding, yeah. I will say we have all support for this version. No one has pushed back on this, so I feel pretty comfortable with it. But I can get an official,
Well, it'd be nice to know too, should there be a phase in or not, right? Or should this just go live July 1? Or do we need more time to prep the retail community?
And I don't know if they were invited in, and I don't want to volunteer them for it, but I've had some informal conversations with the AG's office. It may be interesting to hear from them. I'm not sure if they have an official office.
Other question? Michael?
This is not a question for you, actually, maybe because there's nothing new under the sun, so I'm sure that this has happened in the past where lower denomination has been weeded out. Trying to think if we had a half cent.
Maybe in Europe?
Yeah, that's possible. Well,
Yeah.
The mill, as it's called, does exist. And it is a thousandth of a dollar. I believe it's a tenth of a penny. Typically, there's something gonna come up in electronic transactions. So the lowest, there were half cents that were made at one point in time, is my understanding, and if my research when I was doing the bill initially is accurately coming to my mind. But currently the lowest denomination of physical currency is the penny. Hope that's answering your question.
well, I mean, you know, it was the dark ages compared to where we are now. It would be interesting to know if there were how it's been dealt with in the past, where we're phasing out of corn. I think the Roman era, they used to cut them in half, didn't they?
I don't remember.
Actually, that was kind of rude. That's not what I meant by that.
Actually, what they used to do is shave a little bit off.
They
of the
did,
one.
they did shave a little bit off. That was the inflation.
You're gonna need some chunky scissors.
Yeah. Wasn't it the cost of the copper in it is actually,
For that, yeah.
Anything else for Maggie? Maggie, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jeremy? Morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me in. For the record, Jeremy Little with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. So wanted to start off by thanking you all for having me in for your attention to 837 to Brown's cash transactions. This would particularly affect retailers and restaurants when they're making their cash transactions, so around nearest 5 cents. Considering that pennies are no longer being minted and that the value of the penny over time has continued to decrease, we believe it's a solid option to pursue moving forward. So the fact that the bill makes penny rounding optional is a really good aspect of this bill. It allows businesses that wish to adopt this, that haven't yet adopted it, to adopt it on their own timeline. So they're able to update their point of sale systems. They're able to take the time needed to get that signage and to indicate to consumers that this is a policy that they are implementing within their stores, kind of similar to the we only accept cash, we only accept credit card minimums, similar signage to that. And so this really only applies to cash transactions and the fact that it applies to like after taxation also helps keep it really simple. And so for those reasons, we encourage you all to consider adding this to whatever economic development bill that you all are working on.
Thoughts on mandatory versus optional that we were just talking about? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think optional is the better way to go with this, just because as businesses are looking to implement this, some might not find it to be the practice that they want to pursue, others might. And it might be that over time, over the course of a few years, more businesses do decide to use this as a tool in their toolkit. And I know that in Canada, when they first implemented it in 2013, that was implemented as optional and has since seen widespread adoption. But having that opportunity for businesses to slowly implement that as the penny perhaps becomes rarer and rarer over the next decade, couple decades, just allows businesses to take it at their own pace.
Other question?
So thanks for coming. I'm curious, in terms of your members, if they're worried about that they won't have enough pennies, to complete a transaction. Maybe this is a very naive question, but why wouldn't they, if they're worried about that, why don't they just post a price that has either, up or down, doesn't require pennies?
As in, they post a price and then like the post-tax number is.
No, I'm just saying, you're thinking of something that's $199.97. Why not just post it at 95 or, well, I guess I could, maybe that's the answer. You don't want to post it at $200, but it just seems like it's an issue that maybe retailers have the means to address already.
Well, I think this affects more than just retailers too. We could see restaurants that are impacted by this, and then you have, with local option taxes and meals and rooms taxes being different in every location, just having the consistency of, especially if a business has a location in like Burlington, and then they have a location in a place without a local option tax, and then they have a spot somewhere else in the state with a different tax policy, just having the consistency to be able to like set those prices and to be able to determine that I think is a important thing to consider.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would follow up, and one of the things that this is the final digit. So even after tax, because you could do, $5.99, which makes people want to buy it more than if it was $6.
Yeah.
But if it was $5.99, or if it was $6, you add that tax on there, or better yet, if it's $1, and then you add the tax, which becomes $1.06. And that's where the rounding happens in the legislation. So because there's no way well, there is a way. I mean, you could charge at like at 96 cents or 92 cents, and it automatically, that would probably be more difficult for folks, I would suspect. But I think
I get it.
am I correct on that? Is
Yeah,
the
and that would
reason?
also require businesses to calculate that out for like each location that they have to get that final price to be that 5 or that 0. So just with shifting prices and with shifting taxes in each area and with each individual product, whenever a product price goes up or down, or whenever they're trying to figure out what they want that end to sell, it would have to be every product that they would have to calculate that to get it to that 5 or 0.
Yeah, I understand.
Other questions? So does the membership in the chamber don't have the same angst on unfair and deceptive business practice that the retailers have? So be more interested in seeing it optional instead of mandatory.
Yeah, I think the unfair and deceptive business practices is definitely something that some of our membership would, that would also be a part of the impetus for this bill. But I think that it's also another way of looking at it is another tool in the toolbox for businesses to be able to utilize in today's day and age. So it would be kind of that reassuredness of being able to use this tool and knowing that it's something that they can do.
Well, I mean, if you have pennies, you don't have to worry about it. But if you do run out of pennies, then you need something to fall back on. So this is the way that the state of Vermont says this is how you're going to do it. And you're following back on to tell your customers, this is how the state says we have to do this. And it takes that issue of unfair and deceptive business practice right off the table.
Right, and I think that's up to Maggie.
I'm sorry, but Maggie Lenz on behalf of the Vermont Retail Grocers Association, I just want to clarify, because I think it sounded like you said we were asking for mandatory, but we're very happy with this version of the bill. It's a great option.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time making something optional. That if you're worried about unfair and deceptive business practice and you deviate from that option. We'll talk with Ledge Council, we'll talk with the AG's office as well. Any other questions for Jeremy? Thank you. Bye.
Good morning. For the record, Zach Tominelli, I'm the consumer protection advocate for VPER. The committee was inviting us in. This was not something that was, very much on our radar until a few days ago when we got invited. But I appreciate, being invited to try and give a consumer perspective, and I'm willing to do that on, any of these bills affecting consumers. I'll just start by saying that generally we're favorable toward this. I dug in on this a bit yesterday to see what sort of the consumer impacts would be, and it's not zero consumer impact, and I'll touch on some of the research on that in a second. But generally speaking, and as you've already heard, this is the approach that more and more places are taking toward this as the elimination of the penny becomes an issue. Canada eliminated their penny in 2012. This is the approach that they've taken in Canada, so it's the symmetrical rounding concept, and it's probably the fairest way in terms of addressing rounding. I could see how businesses could be interpreting right now with the lack of this sort of guidance that they might be, and this is what I think was happening in Canada until they got this guidance, that companies would round down because they did not want to potentially be liable for saying, well, we're always rounding up, or if we're rounding up, you know, that could be price discrimination, that sort of thing. And what happens there is then the businesses are absorbing the entirety of the elimination of the penny cost, and that, you know, can add up. So this is kind of the fairest way, and I say fairest kind of with an asterisk there. There has been some research into this. The Richmond Federal Reserve looked at this, and because most prices, and you've already kind of observed this, often end in 8s or 9s, 9.99, and in the areas where there isn't a tax involved on that particular transaction, most, not a significant amount, but most transactions tend to actually round up under this system. So what they estimated is if you put this in nationwide, on average a year, it would be a transfer of $6 million from consumers, you know, to businesses. That might sound like a big number, but nationwide a year, that's actually pretty modest. So, you know, I bring this up not to, you know, oppose the bill, or I just want the committee to maybe be aware of what research has been done on this and what's available. This is all in my written testimony. We appreciate that, you know, it contains some important kind of consumer guardrails, although I did know, and Ledge Council brought this up, and I didn't catch this, that it says that the notice could be point of sale or on the receipt. I think that would be a sensible change to just have it be at point of sale. It's not, if anything, it could create more confusion or more angst if somebody got the receipt after they've already paid and realized that it was rounded up or down. So I think having that be at point of sale. And then this question that just came up, this is not in my written testimony, but just the issue of optional versus mandatory. I think this gets a little confusing, and I think Rep. Mikolas actually addressed that whether or not you round being optional, I think makes sense. If you feel like you're going to have pennies and you're tracking that, I don't think that you have to, you know, round. But if you choose to round, having this be the method, I think maybe presents the most clarity for consumers, for businesses, because you're right. In the absence, you say rounding is optional, and you say this method is optional. If a business were to choose, if they were choose to consistently round down, I mean, they would be eating losses. I don't think, you know, any consumer would bring kind of suit. But if business chose to consistently round up, I think you could make the argument that that would be, you know, price discriminatory and a problem. So I think probably the way to approach it is making rounding optional. But if you choose to round, this is the method that the state of Vermont says that, you know, we've blessed basically, and that would allow if it would actually then make it clear, I think, if a business chooses to round and consistently round up, that is in fact actually an unsafe, unfair, and deceptive practice, because they're going outside of what we said is the method for rounding. So that's probably how I would approach that. Happy to take any questions, but
Questions for Zach?
I have a question. I don't know if specifically for Zach, but just in general. When we talk about it being optional, I mean, yes, I think that's great. But I mean, at what time frame is it optional? As in, at when I opened business at 7 o'clock this morning, I had a bunch of pennies, but I was out by 2 o'clock this afternoon. So now I'm going to switch to rounding.
well, I think it's a fair question. I mean, so because this requires point of sale notice, you know, I think you have to be prepared and make that clear that, okay, we're rounding. So however you produce that notice, I think would matter. So, I mean, it could be, I guess, as simple as a sign that you that you put out, you know, at the till saying we are now rounding. So, yeah, it's an interesting question to think, like, is it something that you're bouncing back and forth over the course of the day? I would imagine, and this is where you would want to go talk to business owners, it probably is just easier for them to just make a decision, are we a business that rounds or not, and have that consistency, just have that policy, because you have to train, you know, your staff, your, you know, cashiers, wait staff, or whatever. So I think kind of bouncing back and forth over the course of the day would probably be difficult, I would imagine.
Michael?
I would agree with you. The point of sale is the best way to do it. Plus you could reference that, which, you know, I think of the credit card situation where folks post, you know, we're charging extra because of credit card. So the Treasury Department did provide guidance, which is what's in the legislation based on rounding. So
We could even put something together, working with DFR. just to Actually put that into the bill as well. Here's how you post it. And that, okay. Other questions for Zach? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Morning, for the record, Chris Delia, President of Vermont Bankers Association, what a crowd for discussion of pennies. You're here, I think, because in their infinite wisdom, we made the decision down in Washington to implement a program without any thought as to fallout or repercussions of that implementation.
Pretty much.
Isn't that amazing?
we do.
And some, some of the concerns about access to pennies is already played out in the marketplace, although it is getting better. So if we all go home and grab our pennies and bring them to your bank or credit union and get them back in circulation, this might be a little less problematic. The challenge that we ran into is obviously they stopped minting pennies because it was costing close to 4 cents for the penny, which is not economical. Going to save about $56 million to the taxpayers to not mint the pennies. When that decision was made, the Federal Reserve in their cash distribution centers started to stop the circulation of the penny, even though it is still legal tender. 119 of 165 circulation centers, money circulation centers, stopped circulating. That created the penny shortage in the marketplace for a lot of folks, retailers in particular. We did have situations in Vermont where financial institutions were struggling to get pennies delivered, and therefore merchants were not getting access to pennies to conduct transactions. So a bill like this would seem to make sense. As you heard, it is being discussed in other states and implemented in some states. The Financial Services Committee in the House has passed a bill similar to what you have here, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet. They've been preoccupied with other issues, but there is at least a bill that was passed out of committee down there. It's still got a long way to go, but that would set some national guidance instead of state by state guidance, which is what we're facing right now. I think your discussion about discrimination, non-discrimination is an important one, and what are the mechanics of implementing this? We have no policy position on this bill. Whatever you choose to do to support the business community out there, it would seem to be reasonable to put something on the table for them. I wouldn't call it guidance. I think they need something in statute. Guidance is a little bit more open-ended. I like Rick Nicholas, your approach, voluntary, make the decision whether you want around or not. And then if you are, you've got this policy to follow. But I think it's important to put this on the table because I can see where an individual who's got an EBT card goes in and pays one price, same classification, I don't want to use classification, but the same characteristics of another individual who doesn't use an EBT card but uses cash and goes in and pays a different price. I could see where somebody without some guidance could say, hey, you're discriminating against me, even though I'm just like an individual. So I think it could be very helpful to send a signal out there. How you craft it ultimately in the end, you've got a very good start, but we would certainly not see any issues with you creating such a policy in Vermont statute.
So Because it wouldn't be. Are you suggesting, not suggesting anything, but suggesting that it applies across the board versus just cash?
Nope. I'm just making sure in response to the concerns about whether it's deceptive or not. If you and I are in the same income bracket, we have EBT cards, but you pay cash and I pay with an EBT card, okay? You might get rounded in a way that's not to your favor. Are you gonna say that you're being discriminated against because you paid with cash and I paid with an EBT card? So I think without some policy in place, that's just potentially an example as to why you need to do something to give the merchants and others a clear structure to follow so that they don't fall into that trap.
And that can go both ways.
It can go, it's correct.
I mean, pointing that out, though, I think that whether or not we should make it across the board versus just cash versus to avoid any confusion, electronic or cash, it's just round. You round it.
Oh, the penny is in play if you're doing electronic transaction. Not in play if you use cash.
Correct. But what I'm saying is that, I mean, if we provide statute on it, we could do it so that it's both.
I don't know if Bank of America would agree to that, or Citibank, or any of the other national banks.
Well, it's taken care of at the point of sale, though.
Why don't we hang on to that question for AG or Ledge Council or something like that to talk about how that plays out?
So how does the Congressional Finance Committee bill compare to this, you know?
It's similar in taking what's called a symmetrical approach
Okay,
to rounding.
okay,
Yep.
nearest.
One, two
Correct.
round,
Okay.
and 3, 4 round up.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, Chris? Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.
Eric? Good
Karen
morning.
Allen from the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. Thank you so much for having us. As you've heard from around the room, there has been guidance provided by the Treasury Department that is similar to this proposed legislation. And I think we've heard that it would be helpful to the retailers and to restaurants to have guidance like this as they work with consumers and for consumers to understand what the process will be for them as opposed to sort of not understanding as they approach the register. And so to that point, credit unions would be supportive. Of course, we would look to DFR for additional guidance in terms of how financial institutions would do this in practice. We have been surveying our members regularly to understand the impact of penny production. As you heard from Christelia earlier, in late 2025, the Federal Reserve stopped distribution for the most part, or stopped honoring a request for coin distribution in terms of pennies. And so what we have seen in the state of Vermont is that in a reaction, consumers brought their pennies in to the coin machines. And so for the most part, credit unions have been redistributing that coin to meet member demands. What we have seen, however, is a need to restrict some of that distribution to retailers. When they come in and request coin, we don't necessarily always have those rolls of pennies to give out so that they can use it in their own businesses. So we certainly anticipate that as this rolls forward over the course of the next several years, that it will become a bigger issue than it is today. But as it stands, we are able to maintain pennies as requested for our membership. And we're processing that in terms of cash distribution in the branches with what we already have on hand. But we are supportive in general of this draft legislation.
Questions for Carrie? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron, did you ask to weigh in?
I would like to, thank you.
Good morning, Thomas Weiss, resident of Montpelier. And as you know, one of my concerns in this committee is data protection and data privacy. And I would like to point out one of the requirements in H 837 as it was introduced. It's on page 3 of the bill. It's subsection E, optional use number 2. This section shall not require a person or business to accept cash if the person or business has posted a clear policy stating that the person or business does not accept cash. I think that's inappropriate for this bill. I don't see how retail businesses that I walk into the store can not accept valid US legal tender currency for purchases. So I would ask you to remove that subdivision 2. So that it's silent on it, but you're not condoning or encouraging businesses who try to not accept US legal currency tender.
Question for Tom?
Is that even legal? To like say you can't accept
I was
cash?
just in a parking garage in New Hampshire yesterday and they didn't want to let me out because I didn't want to use a credit card there. It said no credit cards only. So I don't know whether it's legal or not, but it's happening.
For Tom? Percolating.
No, I was gonna say something snarky, but you know, too early in the week for that.
To me? To me?
No,
You should.
no.
I do have one other comment. 40 years ago, I was working as a civilian on a US military base in Germany. They had the mapping policy in place then because it was too expensive to ship pennies overseas because none of it came back. There is a segment of the population who has had that experience, probably is still having that experience with the rounding. It didn't seem to be a big issue. So thank you very much for fitting me in on short notice. Thank you, Tom.
Cameron, like to chat with us about the questions that were raised. I think we will actually ask Deputy Commissioner of Banking from DFR to come in. Someone from the AG's office to come and chat to us too.
A few quick things, just in response to some of the discussion that's been had. As I mentioned at the beginning of my testimony, I'm not aware of anything that prohibits a business from doing this or rounding in any way they can. I think the comments from Mr. Delia kind of outline a concern that probably could exist. Could have someone who is, you know, perceiving at the point of sale some sort of different treatment based on how they're interacting with the purchase. You know, whether that rises to some sort of discriminatory effect. It's obviously going to depend on the facts of the circumstance and, you know, what is the justification for the business in doing what they're doing. The business comes in and says, I'm rounding because physically can't get enough pennies to conduct transactions in pennies, and you're applying that same rounding in every cash transaction, regardless of who the individual is on the other end of the point of sale. I think it's probably going to be a hard case to make that the business is somehow discriminating against you as an individual based on some characteristic that gives you protection, right? Think about discrimination, you need some sort of protected characteristic to be able to argue that you're being discriminated on the basis of that characteristic. So, but I totally understand the fact that there is question out there among the community about whether or not that puts them in some sort of circumstance that the argument could be made. And as you all know, of course, until a court makes that ruling and makes that, determination, then it could be an open question. I do think that was, as it was brought up, if you're going to put something in statute to authorize a business to rent in a particular way, I do think that then potentially raises a question if the business decides to round in a different way. I think it would interject some question, some legal question that doesn't exist now. A business wanted to round up all transactions to any amount. Somebody could argue, I imagine, that there's some sort of hidden fee there, and that's an unfair deceptive act if you were to round up, the transaction is $9.97, and you're like, okay, final cost is $20. Where'd that come from, right? So I imagine if something like that were going on, there's probably a case to be made. I would need to go back and talk to the AG and do some further research on our statutes about, potential hidden fees or some sort of deceptive acts there. But again, as I've kind of discussed, the business gets to set its own price as a general matter. So if the business wanted to go through and determine for every single price point in the store, calculate what the taxes would be and set the initial sale price at an amount that after taxes were charged would equate to an amount that rounded to a 5 or a 10, there's nothing that stops them from doing that. I imagine for a grocery store with, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of items possibly, that could be very difficult to do, especially with prices that go, fluctuate daily, weekly, monthly, etc.
But there'd also be a lot of inconsistency for national chains. Like a Price Chopper or Hannaford, a lot of times they set their prices at least regionally. And if you have one town that has a local option tax and the other one doesn't.
Well, the local option tax is going to affect the price regardless, but yes, you would have to factor that in, right, to the initial sale price as you're mentioning. If you have a local option tax or not, and I'm wanting the final price to be at a 5 or a 10, then I would have to figure that out based on the individual town. Yes, sir, totally understood. And that's my point. It could be my point is there's nothing stopping them from doing that. As far as I'm aware, in statute, business gets to set the price. If they want to set it at a price that where the end of the transaction equates to something that doesn't result in a penny, I think they could. Very problematic, probably very burdensome to do so, depending on the town you're in, different taxes, etc. Totally. I'm just pointing that out because I do, if you then put something into statute to say you may round, and you may round in this way, and then a business starts to round in a different way. Let's say if the transaction ends in a 1 or 2 and the statute says they should round down, but they start rounding up everything gets rounded up to the nearest nickel instead of any rounding down. Does that then violate the statutory section? I would argue yes. So I do think if you want to go forward in that regard, probably worth having a conversation. Talking with the AG, who ultimately would likely be some sort of enforcer here, to determine you can authorize it, have a may as the initial. The business may round the cap transaction, but to be very clear, if you all want, if you're going to round the transaction, then it shall be done in this manner to make sure there's no ambiguity there. So I think that may be worth further discussion and possible alterations to the bill, just to make sure it's explicitly clear. I do think that is a question. The other question I know that came up was about whether you could round electronic transactions, and that is something I will need to do some additional research on. I think you're when you get into that rabbit hole, I think you're probably layering on many more federal laws and federal regulations about electronic fund transactions. And so if you would like, I could start going down the rabbit hole, but I would potentially at the outset keep the bill the way it is if you're going to stay clear of that minefield. Just allow the electronic funds to be transacted in pennies, because there's no, you know, there's no challenge that a business is trying to overcome, at least in relation to the cash transactions that you're discussing. So.
Real quick. I was the only person that asked that question, and I don't think you need to spend your time on that. Treasury says that, yeah, but it's okay. Even though I don't think it is.
Do you have time for one more?
Real quick.
So is it the case then that there is no de minimis when it comes to consumer protection, and that consumer protection goes down to the penny?
I'm not sure I follow the question.
The point is that we will create statute to dictate down to the penny level. That's what I'm wondering, is if we have an obligation through statute to have consumer protection get to this granular a level. That's what I'd like to know.
Okay. You mean in the context of the rounding itself? Right. If I'm interpreting your question, I don't think off the top of my head, I don't think there's anything that would stop you from just saying that a business may round to the nearest nickel and leave it at that. And then businesses may determine it's in their best interest to always round up, because they're going to get a few more pennies per each transaction by doing so. So I think it's really a policy decision for you all if you want to mandate that if the final transaction ends in a digit that ends in a 1 or 2, it has to be rounded down, 6 or 7 rounded down, you know, and versa rounded up. If you wanted to get to that level of detail on what the transaction ends per penny, I think you can. That's what I've seen in the other states. I don't recall seeing one that didn't identify at that level, but ultimately, I think if you wanted to have a more broader statement that authorized a business to round to the nearest 5 cents and do not specify that it needs to be down in certain instances and up in certain instances, I'm not aware of anything that would prohibit you from doing that either. I think that answers your question.
Okay. We have to get to the floor. So we'll come back to this at the end of the week. The AG come in, DFI come in, chat with us more about it, and then I think as Maggie had suggested, we're looking at S327 vehicles for this. So any questions, committee, before we go to the floor? So we're on the floor, we much shorter floor today than we've been accustomed to. And so we'll have lunch, caucus's luncheon back here at 1.